Hi, my name is Tom Udiger. I'm with IBM Services. I'm part of our public markets practice area, focusing mostly on healthcare and life sciences project. I am part of the AI and machine learning practice. So we get to do all the cool and exciting data science work that's out there that our customers have need for. So I've been with IBM for about 11 years, and in my time at IBM, I've worked in a variety of different practice areas and doing different types of projects for clients over the last 11 years. Prior to IBM, I had my own specialty consulting group that specialized in information governance for about 8 years. And before that, I had a blast doing video game development. Had another startup of my own where I did some console development for PlayStation and Sega Saturn. So very exciting work in there. These days, I live in Middle Tennessee, which is just a little south of where you guys are in Louisville. And I spend a lot of time with my family, my wife, my 3 kids, a couple of dogs, and I'm an avid startup fan, helping local companies get their startups off the ground, and I help a lot with Boy Scouts. During this time, feel free to post questions in the chat. I will be answering questions in the chat. So as they pop up with things I say or other questions, go ahead, post the question. I'll be sure to try and get that answered. Maybe if not with a right question, at least a humorous answer to your question. All right, so I work for this little tiny company, International Business Machines. We've been around for just a touch over a century. In that time, we've done 1 or 2 things that may have had a little bit of impact on the world. The punch card, everyone's favorite. We got started with that in the 1880s. One of our predecessor companies, which got merged together in 1911, created the first punch cards, and of course we standardized it. We were participating in some of the first computers like the Harvard Mark I. We built some of the first computer languages like Fortran, which is still around and some people are still using it. Sabre, which was the first airline reservation system for American Airlines. We helped with a couple of those little space missions you may have heard about, like Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. And you may have seen in Hidden Figures recently them talking about the human computers taking over to support the IBM computers, and as the years have progressed, so we've had quite a bit of impact in our time over the last 100+ years, and of course we've brought many exciting advancements to the world of education, like the Scantron. And everyone in school has always enjoyed the Scantron. So you have IBM to thank for that. Just a quick view of who IBM is and how we've changed over the years. We really started out as a hardware company. Software really didn't exist a long time ago. It wasn't really until the invention of the IBM mainframe that you could create portable software that can move from hardware platform to hardware platform. Before that, everything was super custom. Each computer was different. The programming was done very manually. And of course, we started back in the day, and we've mostly been doing hardware. As time has progressed, we slowly began developing software. We really got into the software into the 1980s. And then, of course, you'll see this line here starting in about 2010. This is where we really stepped into the world of AI. Now, we didn't call it AI because at the time, and you talked about AI in a business context, companies would laugh you out of the room. So we created this term cognitive. So we, rather than talking about AI and people say, "Ooh, that's crazy. That's weird stuff. That's not real. We can't bring that to the business world." We started talking about cognitive computing. We had gone and created Watson to go and crush those humans on Jeopardy, and that created a real interest that, wow, AI has something going for it. But we called it cognitive computing so that we could actually go and have good, strong, solid C-level conversations with folks. And Then, of course, our competitors out there went ahead and decided that they needed to differentiate themselves from IBM, so they started calling it machine learning and AI. Back to where we were differentiating ourselves. So, in the last year, we've really focused. We have really made this an important part of our business, not just for our customers. Right now, we're doing half of our business with some form of hybrid cloud and cognitive or AI as part of the business that we do with our customers. And it's a huge amount of business in an organization like IBM. We're also applying it to ourselves. We're also transforming our organization so that when we talk to our customers, we can say, yep, see, we just did that last year, and look at the value it's bringing to us. So this is some of what's important about understanding where we're going. It's not just that we're talking about it, we're also delivering it to our customers and applying it to ourselves. So here you are, going to school, working on a degree, most likely in data science, possibly in computer science. Also, maybe you're doing something outlandish like linguistics. What do you need to learn in order to be a good data scientist? Well, our world of data science it's quite broad and complex. There's no way for you to learn it all. Within data science, we have many subspecializations. We have people that focus deeply on data. And they have other people that focus very much on computer vision, doing lots and lots of computer vision work. We have other people that focus on natural language processing. And then we have other folks that do lots of statistics, and the list goes on. You can't learn all of it, but you can learn to specialize, and you have to specialize. You develop some deep skill in one of these key areas. And then, of course, you need a series of other skills to be around that world of data science so that you can be conversant, know how to connect to those other domains of data science, and bring it all to bear. Also, most importantly, data science does not live in a silo. You got to learn computer science. You have to learn computer engineering. The software engineering is important. Most of our projects, if we're doing smaller, bit-sized AI experiments, those are great. We can live almost 100% within a data science world. However, as we move into putting something into production, you suddenly need all kinds of other skills, and you need to be conversant with those skills. And so we're going to touch on those as we go along. One of the other things that's really important is just you need a skill, some kind of domain knowledge, something other than computer science and something other than data science. You need to know public health policy, public speaking, or in some cases, linguistics. Linguistics is a great example of something you need knowledge of in order to make natural language processing work. I have had projects where I've worked with taught the linguists, hired somebody onto the project team who was a linguist, or maybe had a deep skill in Latin or ancient Greek, and because they understood linguistics well enough, I could teach them enough to be useful on the projects around data science. And so that knowledge of the domain of linguistics matters more, and then you bind that with your data science skill, and then you can generate value. So it's really all about generating value for whoever your customer is. That might be, you might be working for a company, you might be working for customers, but you need to learn all of that not data science stuff that makes all of this possible and these projects really exciting to work on. So also, you can need to learn to be curious, you need to have deep thirst for knowledge, and of course, most importantly, you need to be helpful. This is kind of an odd advice, but we live in this space of machine learning and AI, and people look at us and they don't understand what we're talking about. And so you have to step back from our world of being the data scientist in your lab coat approach to the world, and you need to open up and help people understand enough so that you can communicate back and forth effectively, so they can meet you halfway and you can meet them halfway. So be considerate and helpful. It will go a long way, and it's a strange thing to say about data science, but it's actually one of those soft skills that we find incredibly important. Speaking of soft skills, critical thinking. I can't stress this one enough. Critical thinking, critical thinking, critical thinking. Also, learning to communicate, tell stories. How do you communicate? Via email, via a write-up, via a presentation, stand up and give a public talk. These are incredibly important skills. Teamwork as well. How do you work as a team? I had one of the people that works for me on a project. I asked him, so what makes a good data scientist? And his comment back to me was, well, what makes a good data scientist is a good data scientist will wake up in the morning and go check Jira to see what tickets are pending that have been assigned to him. Go get those tickets taken care of rather quickly, make sure it's all good, make sure nobody else has any problems, and then go check to see if some job that he had running overnight or some notebook he had running overnight crashed and needed to get fixed. He said, and then his comment was, a bad data scientist will get up in the morning, check to see if his notebook had crashed, then spend hours and hours and hours on Stack Overflow and trying to find an answer to his problem, and then realize it was something incredibly silly and have wasted most of the day, and then finally get around to his Jira tickets. So it's a question of how do you work well with team members. So really important. Something else that's really become very important at IBM and also across the broader portion of the software industry is this idea of design thinking, a user-centric approach to how on earth do we create software for folks. And so we'll touch on this a bit later. And then, of course, software engineering. You must learn the basics of software engineering because these days AI is being infused in vast amounts of software, and the software engineering skills are infinitely important to making those projects successful. And of course, take some fun classes in odd stuff like handwriting. When you show up and have beautiful calligraphy, that's awesome. Philosophy, ethics, Egyptology. Who doesn't like studying mummies? And of course, my favorite was, of course, when I went to school, I took Norse mythology, and this, of course, helped me with my children when the Avengers came out, because I could keep up with and tell them more about Asgard and Midgard than they knew, and of course, that made me slightly cooler than they were. And of course, Latin. I keep coming back to this idea of linguistics. We like to talk about natural language processing. Your understanding of how language and how to manipulate language becomes really important as we're doing these data science projects that are not statistics centric or raw number centric. When they're dealing with language, whether that's in English or Spanish or pick your language of choice, whether we're doing that in a spoken language or we're doing that in a written language, the ability to understand how language comes together and how you manipulate it really helps with making some of these natural language processing projects successful. Yeah. All right, so moving on to my first example. This is a project we did which will impact flight safety around the globe. There's this small little company called Flight Safety International. I had the privilege of working with these guys to put this project and this program together in its early days. So what we did is we built an adaptive learning experience for pilots. So how do you train pilots? One of the biggest problems that happens is that it takes hundreds of hours to train a pilot to become good. And the FAA looked at it as, well, if you have enough hours in the flight simulator seat and you don't crash that often, that qualifies you to fly a plane. And you may have to make sure that you deal with some of these, the various problems that occur on maybe takeoff or landing as you do these various maneuvers. So the idea really was a human. So as you'll see in this picture with the red window, with these red windows. So this is the red screen of death, and very important to not crash your plane. But there would be this instructor sits in the instructor seat in these huge flight simulators, and they sit back and they watch the pilots and they give corrective information back to the pilots, either in real time sometimes or later in a flight debrief of what went well, what went wrong. However, that instructor has a limited field of view. They can see pretty much what the hands of the pilot are doing, but not necessarily what they're doing with their feet and the pedals and things of that nature. They can maybe see the person tensing up, but they can't see everything that they're doing. What we did and what we were asked to do was, is there any way to get into these machines? Some of them have 500 sensors built in, some of them have a couple thousand sensors into it. And so there are already these flight simulators are instrumented with lots of IoT devices in there, spitting out vast amounts of data. So what we ended up doing was we had a team go in. They looked and identified which sensors we should work with. We found about 70 to 80 that actually gave us good information to work with. And then we did things like learned how to identify when somebody's turning left, when somebody's turning right. No, I guess I got that backwards. Turning right, turning left, and then where they're taking off, what their takeoff looks like, what their landing looks like, how they're dealing with various other things during their cycle of flight. And so what we did is we learned to deal with that. We then also learned we created a gold standard. So now we could take a person who is flying, the student pilot is flying, they do some maneuver, and we can compare that maneuver against a standardized best practice maneuver, and we can then score how well they actually did. And so this was truly amazing. And what we were able to do was create a system where we could see how well an individual student pilot was mastering the skill of flying these huge jets. Now, in that middle picture there, you see Andy. Andy is the pilot, is not the pilot. He's the person we put in charge of this program. And the reason is he's a pilot. He got his pilot's license. He got to have lots of free flight time and under the guise of, I have to test the system. He learned to fly these things and we get feedback from the system and really improved. So what we could identify were weaknesses that the student had, how they responded to certain scenarios. We could see if they're stomping too hard on a pedal under certain circumstances. And interestingly enough, we learned to identify students that we should wash out early, that just don't have the skill to fly these big jets. So this was really, really, truly an exciting program. And so we ended up with showing off these kinds of panels, these dashboards, to the instructors. So they would, we could score the students. We could now see how the individual maneuvers were, why they failed, what reasons they were failing, what maneuvers they should start working on because they're potentially weak in a certain area, or they've maybe mastered some basic skills and it's time to move them to more advanced maneuvers, what their overall sense of mastery was, what their progression trend, how we could wash them out, how they're doing compared to other students. So this became a way to actively measure the quality of a student as they're growing as a pilot. So very exciting work. And we built this for Flight Safety International. They have their customers. One of the first customers, if you noticed on the top of the page there, United States Air Force. We deployed this, and there has been several classes of new Air Force pilots that have had to go through this type of training, and the feedback that it has given has been invaluable for the team. So very exciting project. Not every project is like this. Not every machine learning project is as exciting and unique and transformative as this one is, but we do have these come up with regularity, and thought I'd share this one with you. So in order to do a project of that nature, we need to understand the business that we're working with. So we have a view of the market. And this is kind of a view of And this is what data scientists do. So we do come in and we do take these tops-down view. We do understand where the organization is, especially when you're in a consulting group like ourselves. Our consulting organization really focuses on you needing to be a consultant first and a data scientist second and sometimes third. So the traditional enterprise really is, it's our old school enterprises. It's our corporations that they have some technology, they have it deployed, but it's not part of their who they are and what they're doing. So they do some experimentation here and there, or maybe they have their accounting system running. So we have lots of companies that fit into this category still today. What we've been advocating has been this concept of the cognitive enterprise for a couple of years here, which is this idea of you really need to bring in the technology deep into your organization. You need to combine the cloud technologies that are out there, some of these exponential technologies like AI, blend it together, drive some innovation through your organization, and really kind of move this digital from being pieces and parts of your organization into the center and make it core to what your company is. Then, of course, our next view of where the companies where our customers are going really is this idea of the virtual enterprise. And everything at this point has become digital. And so there are some companies that are moving very rapidly in this direction, where they are trying to blend humans and AI together, and they are bringing intelligence to all their workflows in their organization. They're very, very focused on growing the technology stack in a way that is a little different. And so that's where we would call the cutting edge right now. But we see companies moving in that direction, and we're helping a lot of those organizations get there. And of course, you as new data scientists joining our ranks in either this year, next year, in the next couple of years, you'll see more and more of this through your careers, as it's going to be less about the coolness of the AI and more about how does machine learning get infused throughout the processes of an organization. So this is what our clients struggle with. This is just this idea of there's all these pressures. You can put them in some major buckets, of course, technology, market, competition, and they're squeezing on the outside of these organizations. And there's global pressures, there's regulatory things hitting you, there's cost issues, there's social, there's new people, those new entrants in the in the marketplace that are trying to disrupt the company's business. Customer expectations, like one of the things is they say, we like to talk about is the last best experience a customer had is now the new standard that everyone has to meet. And so a lot of our clients are realizing this, that they just were able to go to Amazon and somebody went and clicked and was able to order something on their phone. And why can't your company, company X, why can't you do that? It's so easy. Amazon can do it. Why can't you do it? And so we get those kinds of conversations. And how do we help some of these organizations that might be hindered by regulatory barriers, that can't actually deploy some of these things? They might like to, but they can't for a variety of reasons. How do we work through that? How do we still create user experiences and get AI infused? And you'll notice AI is just but one of the technology pressures that's coming to bear. So people worry about how do they deal with all their different technology stacks? How do they get their old stuff to new? And of course, how do we get the mindsets? How do we get the skills of those companies' employees reframed and set for what we talked about, either the cognitive or the virtual enterprise, and as it comes up. So these are the big pressures that our clients feel on a day-to-day basis, and the pressure, it gets intense more and more and more as we progress. Now, we've taken that view of how do we saw that first thing, which was we saw those enterprises, the old traditional enterprise, the cognitive and the virtual enterprise. And then, of course, we've talked about those many pressures. But when it comes to a company, this is how they think. And what they have is they've got a business view of what this is. So here's kind of an example of an electronics an electronics industry point of view, which is the CEO, CFO, whomever says, hey, improve business results. We need to do this. And how are we going to do this? You can either improve your capital efficiency. Maybe you can work on operating margins. Maybe that's increasing sales or reducing costs somehow. And then, of course, these then flow into a set of processes. And so there are all these processes in different industries. Different industries have different processes that come to bear. There are some generic ones that kind of go from industry to industry to industry and span all of them, say like some types of various processes in accounting. But this is where we begin to really focus as data scientists. We need to pick the client. The client may come in and say, I'm having this problem. We need to go and understand what that process is. So we need to have domain expertise in that space. Pick something, it might be supply chain, it might be energy usage within the organization, like maybe data centers cost a lot, or how do we they consume vast amounts of electricity. Maybe it's engineering or developing new engineering works for your company, building new devices, testing that all out. So there are all kinds of different processes that come to bear. Inside that process, there are opportunities to infuse it with AI. And this is really important, but you can't infuse the AI and the machine learning into that business process without some domain expertise. And so this comes back to, I'll come back to it over and over again, you need to develop some form of domain expertise around something within the business world that you're consulting on. It comes from, you might spend years at a company and you become really good at regulatory work. Maybe you become really good at, pick anything. I mean, maybe it's supply chain and we find ways to bring this in there. Or sometimes you may not have those skills or you'll never have the domain knowledge, and you need to pair up with somebody who has the domain knowledge but doesn't have the machine learning skills, and you've got to learn to communicate and work together and have teamwork in order to actually drive to and improve that basic business process. So this is where the reality meets the road with a lot of our data science these days. So how do we do that? We have this concept of the golden thread. This is a term we take from design thinking, and how the design thinking says that we need to focus on what is the user experience. They're coming into some process, they're trying to achieve some goal, and what is the best way that we can take them from where they are to the outcome that they desire. And of course, there are sometimes conflicting outcomes. Maybe they want to return, something. Let's say we sold them something, they want to return it. We want to minimize the returns, and so we might have some conflicting things. But how do we get through that cycle so that the client is happy and the company's happy at the same time? And so we create that golden thread, and it's focused on understanding the market pressures, understanding the outcomes, and then weaving it through the ecosystem that a company may have. They have lots of different systems that are there. And of course, we might do some IoT, we might do some AI, blockchain might be involved, lots of automation. And of course, we ideally layer it on top of a common data fabric, so our information that's flowing into the various processes is clean, standardized, and easy to use and consume and keep up to date. And of course, if we've got good data flowing in, we can then use that in our models to do better projections on interacting with those customers in the future and improve the outcomes there. So golden thread, it's an important concept in the world of design thinking. And you will hear more about design thinking as you begin to enter the working world, especially in large enterprises. You'll hear lots about design thinking. And I highly recommend that you dive deep into it before you graduate. Learn about design thinking. So here's a project I worked on as well. This is a different style of data science. So everyone's worked with a chatbot. You've used a chatbot. You've used Siri. You've used Google Assistant. They have their good spaces. You've gone to various websites and you worked with the chatbots, and some of them have just sucked. Absolutely sucked. And in that, people didn't necessarily design the user experience. So this is healthcare. People are coming in here, they're often have a lot of stress going on in their life, and they are trying to get to a successful outcome. Be that they need to make sure the claim has been paid, or they need to find out the status of can they be pre-authorized for some procedure. And so we worked with Anthem, and we designed that golden thread for how people come into Anthem, how they interact via a chatbot, via a mobile app, or pick up the phone and call, have them really come in and work through that. Now we have members, people that actually consume and use the healthcare services. We have providers. Providers need to come in and ask questions like their doctors, their hospitals, and they need to find out if you're actually authorized to use, or how much of a copay they need to charge you, or things of that nature. We have employers that need to log in, employers that need to come in and say, hey, so-and-so just had a new baby, we need to put them on the plan so that they can now get insurance. And of course, we have brokers, which are part of the healthcare payer ecosystem, and they work with smaller employers and provide a lot of management capacity around that. So how do you create these chat interactions and make them work well so that people have higher customer satisfaction scores? This was our key thing, is how do we make it so that people aren't frustrated and just go agent, 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 or human, 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 or something. They want to bypass the chatbot because their previous experience has been so bad. So that's one of the things we worked at. So with a tool like Watson Assistant, which was at the core of this, and Watson Assistant is IBM's virtual agent tool, it became the tool that we used to drive this experience forward. Interestingly enough, we took as much of the data science out of Watson Assistant as possible. We tried to create tools so that we could have business analysts focus on creating that user experience and not worried about coding. Do I need to tweak a model? How do I tune this? How do I tune that? We still had quite a bit of data science on this. There are some still things like speech to text, text to speech that do require more tuning and training of models. But most of this work is all linguistic centric. It's not tuning a model that requires you to understand statistics and things of this nature. It's really about understanding language and how does language work? How are the multitudes of ways for people to come in and ask the same basic question and get to an intent of what they're looking for, and then that can then drive to some workflow that helps drive them to a successful outcome. Like, hey, I want to look up my claim. What's the status of my kid's claim? Why didn't it get paid? I paid that. Why? There's those questions. Or do I get this benefit? Hey, I'm going in for this type of surgery. Is it covered, or how much of it is covered? So lots of things like this. Very exciting. This link down here, you can listen to our customer here at Anthem. He will happily chat. He talks about how we built it out, the things that we did. And it's a 4-year program. We've been into this program with them for a couple of years now, and they're having huge positive customer satisfaction back for this. So 1 in 8 of you somewhere in this class or in this webinar probably have Anthem as your healthcare provider. So check it out. They have a mobile app called Sydney. It does the chat, or you can go on the website and do chat. And soon we're rolling out voice-based AI with it as well. This one was an interesting, quick project. The client showed up to us and they said, we need to stand up a voice virtual agent in 3 weeks. There's an announcement coming out that we are going to be one of the providers for COVID shots, and we have a 500-person call center. It's going to get overwhelmed with the phone calls that are coming from all over the country. What can you do? And from design to go live, 3 weeks, we stood up a virtual agent that took in millions and millions of calls. So when they first launched and the first announcement first came out, they were overwhelmed. People sat on hold for 5 hours, 6 hours. It was crushing them. We turned the virtual agent on. 70% of the calls got handled by the AI. Clients were happy. The customers were happy, and the call center volumes dropped down to something reasonable that could actually be handled. So sometimes it's fast and furious, but always interesting with this is everything we do goes into production. And so we always have a laser-like focus on how do we get our data science into production. So this is one of those issues. How do we get stuff into production? And so most companies out there are struggling with this idea of how do we get past basic experimentation. Hey, we hired these data scientists and they're sitting around and they're playing with this thing called Jupyter Notebooks, and they're doing some cool experiments and everything, but it's costing me lots of money and it's not going into production. So they're just saying, I'm not seeing the value of data science. And so these are actual quotes from customers that don't understand how to apply machine learning in their organization. And they started off where most customers do. They start off here. This is our typical story. We've talked to I don't know how many customers about this. They have a grand idea. Hey, wow, AI is super special. Let's get something and deploy it. It's going to be magic. It's going to be a silver bullet. And of course, they bring in some data science people, and because they're scientists, they're clearly going to be smart and they're going to do all this cool stuff. So they try to do something, and of course, the directives they're given, the team that gets stood up to do it, more often than not gets told, go do these magical things, and they do lots of data science experiments. And these data science experiments, in and of themselves, are really cool. They solve a problem. But what they don't do is they don't make it into engineering. And after a while, there's this big cost that begins to build up, and then we reach the moment of truth. The moment of truth is when somebody says, get rid of this data science team. They're absolutely worthless, of no value. Let's go back to the way we used to do software engineering and not bother with this data science. And there goes the data science team. Maybe they get laid off. Maybe they get folded into the basic software engineering team. Who knows? And we, of course, enter the long, dark tea time of the soul, where people are going, we did some data science, but it didn't do anything for us. And then they become gun shy. They don't understand why it didn't work. And this is where, somewhere along the line, somebody gets enterprising, successful, maybe inside the company. Somebody chats to a friend at another company, says, this is how we did it, and we were successful about bringing it. And they don't call it a data science project. They just call it a software, some software engineering project, and they add a little bit of data science, but nothing big, right? And suddenly it's successful. And then the momentum begins to build upon itself. So the key here really is the combining of the data science with the software engineering and bringing it together to get something into production that is creating results. Now, sometimes some of those results that make it into production have made big headlines in the story because the AI has done exactly what you told it to do, and you never gave much thought to the impact of what that would do. And of course, leads to questions like ethics in AI. What are you doing? This makes no sense. This was wrong and cruel. A human never would have done that. But how we train things, how we think about things, and this has a lot to do with data science maturity in an organization. And so then we begin to put in forensic technology, begin to develop a culture around how to build AI properly, and then we reskill teams, we set teams up, and then of course we eventually build toward this concept of a trusted AI and getting that deployed within the organization. So we see this over and over and over again. Very few companies manage to start here, the all-knowing AI, and make it up this curve here without hitting the stumbling block. Some companies like to hit this stumbling block multiple times, and they go over it back and forth, maybe in different parts of the company at different times, and eventually they do make it here. We're beginning to see more and more companies realizing that they have to bring these two disciplines together in order to get to success. So as we operationalize AI, we have the people that engineer things, we have the people that deploy things, we have the people that monitor things, and then of course we have the trust and transparency. And they go in a circle over and over and over again. With machine learning projects that we deploy, this is not like old software engineering projects. You build the project, you put it into production, you have a couple of people maintain it, maybe reboot the software once in a while, and it was done. With our AI projects, this is something that upper management is slowly learning, is there's lots of TLC, lots of tender loving care that needs to be poured into these AI systems on a regular basis to account for drift. Model drift is, how do you detect it? How do you find it? How do you do things? Things like virtual agents, there's almost a continuous change in human language happening. So you're not accounting necessarily for model drift. You're accounting for language change or business change, new terminology. Hey, we've got a new marketing program. We've got to now take all that new marketing information, fold it into what the AI is hearing from the end users, so that we can now account for and make sure it's routing stuff to the right place so that we can properly answer. So this goes all around here. And you'll notice out of this, under the engineering side of this, there's only one bucket that says model development. This is one of the things I keep running into with new kids that join our consulting practice, is they all want to dive deep into model development. And they go, when do I get to really get into model development? It's like, well, we maybe spend 10% of our time working on that with projects. We got all these other cool things that we got to do in order to get a project through to production and actually delivering value to the end user. So that's an important thing, is to understand these all depend on each other, and they go around and around and around in circles quite often. That. All right, so what kind of degree do I need in order to be a data scientist? So this one comes out often, and of course it's different for those of us that may have a little bit of possum blonde in our hair, but I'll deny that I have any of that. The gray hairs versus the fresh out of school. So back in the day, there were no data science degrees. In fact, 11 years ago, when I first joined IBM, you had to have a PhD in mathematics in order to join the data science practice. If you didn't have a PhD in mathematics, thank you for playing, goodbye, and off you went. The data science practice the practice of data science has since matured a lot. And as a result of that maturity, lots of tools have grown up. You no longer need the depth of mathematics that you used to need, 10 years ago. These days, you can still do data science now, and you don't need to know as much. You don't need to know as much about mathematics. In fact, sometimes you're better off knowing linguistics, as I'll point out several times in this talk. So these are some of the degrees I've seen. Some of my coworkers have degrees in computer science, absolutely. Degrees in statistics, math, physics. I happen to be a physicist by trade. Chemical engineering. Medieval history. This is a good one. Medieval history. And I have a friend who's a data scientist that has a degree in medieval history. One of our distinguished engineers, she has a degree in archaeology. So that degree has come in quite helpful in the space of data science. Another one is classics. So classics is ancient Latin, ancient Greek, and the learning and the speaking of that. Of course, those people do really well on the natural language processing side of data science. Degrees in linguistics. I know of at least one guy who has no degree and managed to flunk out of high school. And yet he still is a rock star data scientist. I don't recommend this path these days. You have the automated tools that are kicking you out if you don't have a 4-year degree on your resume. So the fresh out of school side of life, data science, computer science, math, statistics, these are all great, solid degrees that we need. Linguistics, highly recommend linguistics. So for those of you who know a linguist, data science is a great place to be. Recently, I just hired this woman to our practice. She had a degree in linguistics and had been out teaching. She was actually a teacher, would teach English as a second language, and started doing Python on the side to try and help do the rating and scoring of reading levels for various students. And she kept adding, because she had domain expertise in linguistics and teaching, she did a much better job and created a really cool little program to improve how you actually score reading levels. So, for those of you who have kids or will have kids in the future, all those books, those little kid books, have these reading levels of 100, 200, 300. And she created an automated tool to do a better job of identifying what the appropriate reading level was. So linguistics is an interesting place, and to get data scientists. Design thinking, incredibly important practice. One of our better data scientists, she moved over from our design practice to do data science, and she's awesome. She may not have the depth in mathematics that some of our other folks do, but she rocks when it comes to data science. And of course, fashion merchandising. Who doesn't like fashion merchandising? So this is speaking to Elle Woods from Legally Blonde, but and I make fun of this, but we actually have a fashion designer. One of our fashion designers is one of our lead designers in our public markets practice, and he brings a lot to bear with how to design these AI systems and bring them in there. So it's really amazing. If you want to do the hardcore deep data science, there are roles for you. If there are other roles that are data science light, you may not be really a data scientist. You may be more of a machine learning analyst, business analyst that focuses on machine learning solutions. And we find a lot of these roles can be filled by people that have other degrees and have some other domain expertise. I'm going to stay on this one very, 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 very lightly because there's a lot of information on here, and you can read this after the fact. But fundamentally, this falls into, in order to enable data science in big companies, you have to create a standardized execution model. And this is really important because it's the daily execution model. You don't want to spend all your time doing those little AI experiments we talked about earlier. We want to focus on do it once, do it right, make sure it can go into production. As an example, we stopped doing things with notebooks. Notebooks are great. They were great for a long time. Now it's about getting your chunk of code into production. So what do? Rather than playing a notebook, I sit down, open up PyCharm, write a Python script right there. If I can get it to work, great. Now I can put it into a pipeline, a DevOps pipeline, and throw it into a Kubernetes container, and then that'll get deployed. So if I start in a notebook, I have to waste all that time because now I still have to write that Python script, and because now we're deploying everything in Kubernetes. And so another thing to pay attention to is Kubernetes pipelines. So once again, there are major workflows. How do you identify the problem? How do you design around the problem? How do you then set up your project and provision things? How do you actually do the development work? You'll notice that a lot of this development work, very little of it is actually what you would consider classical data science. Instead, it's how do you analyze things? How do you build data pipelines? How do you connect to databases? How do you do basic software engineering? Then, of course, you've got regulatory issues, you've got ethical issues, you've got vast amounts of testing. We're building up practice areas that focus specifically on how do you do end user testing, system integration testing around machine learning systems. And then, of course, once it's live, you have to support it and scale it. And you have different teams that will do different bits and pieces. And of course, all of this sits on different technology stacks. So it's a vast amount of information to learn. And it takes some time to learn this. You won't learn it all in school, but you will learn it on the job. You'll learn the tools that your company cares about, and what source control tools you care about, what container platforms your company cares about, and how you want to scale and use things over time. So, what other skills do I need besides my degree? Well, domain knowledge, I've harped on this several times. You'll find this is important. Critical thinking, also important. Take those classes in writing, creative writing, analyze English literature, Spanish literature, do the deep analysis. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, always a great story to analyze. But critical thinking, we need people that show up with critical thinking skills. And you get those reading books, analyzing the books, writing papers on those books. Writing, communication, incredibly important, because now you're going from a scenario where you might work with 1, 2 people, and you're dropping people into a team of 50. You have to work on teamwork and communication skills back and forth. Hired this girl a while ago onto our team, and she'd never worked on a group project before, and she'd always done her development as a solo developer, and now she got dropped into a team of 55 and had to and struggled for a while to learn how to interact with the teams, communicate with other human beings around developing the project, and how to communicate status back and forth. Another important thing is storytelling. I was actually giving a talk to a company that does development, and I got a question around what's the one thing I could do better. The guy was asking, what's the one thing I could do better with data science and helping me explain it to upper management? I said, tell a better story. Because the stories have to always be contextualized in a person. So take your time to learn to tell stories. If you're going to try and explain about a human that has a problem and what they have to go through, and then you show that same human going through the new super cool process that you've designed and infused with machine learning, and wow, isn't it better? Tell it as a story, not a scary story like you might tell around the campfire, but a good story nonetheless. Problem-solving skills, planning, goal setting, achieving of those goals, and of course, self-awareness. You have to be aware of other people outside of our practice of AI. They don't understand what we do. My wife doesn't understand it, and I have to try and be aware. Sometimes I'm rambling on, and I see that glazed look, and have to go and explain why it matters and how it can matter. So self-awareness is one of those soft skills that we really need to bring to the table. Of course, there are hard skills to bring to the table, like containers. Learn Kubernetes. Did I mention it? Learn Kubernetes. Learn about containers. They're really important. We deploy our machine learning models into containers, and we have pipelines and DevOps pipelines that deploy those containers into our various environments and promote from development to QA to production or failover to our DR sites, and it's all done with containers. We used it, a few years back, we weren't using containers. Now everything is containerized. So dive deep into containers and understand those. Design thinking, there's some free classes in design thinking. Take a look at them, learn about them. It's a good skill to have. If your school offers design thinking, take the class. Did I mention take the class in design thinking? It's a worthwhile undertaking. It gives you a different point of view of how we now go about designing software and designing solutions for people. Security has become incredibly important. So now, before we deploy anything, it's all about security. We analyze, we automatically scan our codes for security problems, even our models. We look for things of that nature, and we push through security. So Important items. These are hard skills and soft skills. Many of you will be focusing on what are the hard skills I need to learn, but the soft skills. Everyone needs the soft skills to be successful. So back to this first slide. So what do I need to be a data scientist? So there's lots to this space. We've gone over this. Specializing, but learning about the broader space, even as far as learning architecture, you've got to focus on the not data science stuff, because you're going to be spending a lot of your time doing not data science as part of your job, whether you're a consultant, whether you're just hired in as an AI developer at some company. There's a lot of not data science that you need to do in order to be successful in that role. Be curious, critical thinking, design thinking as well, and software engineering. And of course, take a fun class. And in the comments, in the chat window, be sure to tell me what exciting classes you may, and silly classes you may have taken as part of your time here at the University of Louisville. All right, so please post questions, and I will answer those questions in the chat. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, drop me a LinkedIn. Always looking to see what's out there in the world. Love to have shared some of my time with you.
Amy. Okay, Amy, I'm going to talk to you too. It's just easy to have a like it is.
We're live? Good to go? All right. Hello, and thank you for being here. And thank you especially to the Digital Transformation Center and SGA for making this event possible. We are deeply, deeply grateful for that. And I'd just like to welcome you to our panel for ethics and technology. I am Boomer Trujillo. I am an ethicist in the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Louisville. And I'm going to be moderating the discussion today. Today, we've assembled a group of panelists to discuss ethics and technology from various perspectives. And we have about an hour for discussion, and then we'll have a Q&A. So I want to introduce our participants for today's discussion. So first up, we have Beth Case. And Beth Case is the program manager for emerging and assistive technologies and the Delphi Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Louisville. She specializes in developing online courses and ensuring accessibility of online courses. Next, we have Linda Bird-Poller. Linda Bird-Poller teaches at the University of Louisville's Department of Educational Leadership, Evaluation, and Organizational Development. She has over 30 years of experience in education and leadership, and she writes on issues surrounding identity, diversity, wellness, and success in organizations. Next, we have Ulfa Nasrawi. She is professor in computer science and engineering at U of L's Speed School, and she led data science for social good projects in the past, and currently she researches algorithmic fairness in AI and machine learning. And lastly, we have Mia Sims. Mia Sims is an alumna of U of L's mathematics program, and this year will be graduating from the Master of Science in Business Analytics program. But she has many years of experience as a data engineer, business analyst, and educator. So thank you, panelists, for being here. So before we jump into the discussion, I want to provide a bit of a background. Ethics deals with the values that we use to say whether certain actions are right or wrong. It deals with what it means to live a good life or to become a good person. Technology affects all of this, and it enables humans to do more and to become more. But technology, for better or worse, is as creative and powerful as we are, but also as biased and oppressive. Tools reflect their makers, right? Increasingly, ethicists advise us to proceed with caution in developing new technologies. After all, some of the technologies are mysterious. So the black box problem, where we might not understand how it works, even if we do get that we give it certain inputs and we get certain outputs, right? But some of these outputs might reflect unseemly parts of humanity. And so ethicists emphasize that we need to pursue intersectional justice, making sure to attend to simultaneously race, gender, class, ability, and other facets of identity as we take an active role in developing technologies that hopefully contribute to more equitable communities. So with this in mind, I've prepared one question for our panelists, okay? And this should start our conversation, and I hope it's a conversation. We can kind of go back and forth. And as I mentioned, audience, the discussion will be about an hour, then we'll have a Q&A. And so if you have any questions while you're thinking about this, write them down so that you can ask them in the Q&A and we can get you a response. So I've delayed a little bit. Here's your question, panelists, okay? And we'll just go down the line. Your university just received an endowment to study future technologies. And this could be anything that affects our everyday lives to something that might alter the shape of human history. But they tasked you with starting a center. And I just want to know, what's one issue that you would train your members in, and why do you think it deserves some attention? So we'll start with you, Beth, if that's okay.
Okay, so I'm here to give sort of an accessibility or disability perspective on technology and AI. There's about 20 to 25% of Americans and an estimated 1 billion people worldwide that have some kind of disability. And any of us can join that population at any time, as evidenced by a recent injury of mine, where I've had to use a lot of technology to help me do my job. When you lose your dominant hand, you really realize how much you depend on it. And there's a lot of great technology that can help people with disabilities and at the same time create barriers for them. So for example, like automatic captions can really help people who are deaf without the expense and effort of human captioning, but it's not perfect. It has difficulty recognizing accents or technical terms. If you want to have fun, you can go onto YouTube and search for auto caption fail. And it's funny, but it's not. It's funny because of the mistakes, but it's not funny because when those mistakes happen, it's hindering access for people with hearing loss. There's a lot of talk about autonomous cars and how much it will help people who are blind or have other disabilities that prevents them from driving. They could drive themselves to the store. They could drive themselves to doctor's appointments. But we're just not there yet. Safety issues with the cars, recognizing when there's a wheelchair or someone who doesn't walk with a normal gait, that is a hazard and there needs to be aware of it. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Voice recognition technology, which is what I depended on so much when I injured my hand. Again, it helps people who are blind or they can't type, as in my situation. But again, it doesn't work well with accents. If somebody has a speech impediment, what's called deaf speech, the tone of voice a lot of deaf people have, it doesn't recognize those. And as I think we're all going to be talking about, whenever you have a marginalized population that's not included in your training data, it can just perpetuate historical biases. And underrepresented data is seen as undesirable data. So when it shows up, it can be not part of the data set. Those people who have those traits can be excluded, not because they're not qualified, but because they weren't in the original data set. So I want to give like one really famous example. Amazon did a resume screening algorithm where they took the resumes of people who were successful over like 10 years and used that as the template for new resume applicants that were applying, right? But the majority of employees were male. So when women applied, their resumes were not included as being qualified because they didn't have a lot of the same terms and a lot of the same kinds of jobs and things that the male resumes had. So like if it had the word women's in there, like they were captain of the women's chess team, it might not be recognized as something important, whereas if it just said chess team, which is what the men's, of course, is going to say, right? It was not recognized as a desirable trait. So if the algorithm lacks diversity, then it's just going to perpetuate lack of diversity in whatever it's being used for. And if Amazon's algorithm didn't have that many women in its training, how many people with disabilities did it have? Like any, right? And there's other things related to hiring, and you'll probably get to some of this too.
Good segue.
Right, right, you're next. But there may be algorithms that look at the people who are interviewing and analyze like their speech patterns and analyze their face, expressions. And people with disabilities may not have standard body language or facial expressions, and they could be marked down simply because a blind person would have very different expressions than someone who isn't. But the problem is, when it comes to disabilities, I think even more so than when it comes to issues of gender or race, is that they're not the same at all. So the kinds of issues, say, that a blind person might have is going to be very different from someone with cerebral palsy, which is going to be very different than someone who's deaf. And so you can't just simply say, oh, we'll just include more people with disabilities in our algorithm. Because even if someone who has complete vision loss compared to someone who has some vision, they're still going to be very different from each other. Or two people with the same disability still may have very different presentations, different types of technology that they use to cope. And so it's such a diverse population that it's really hard to include those. I just wanted to give one more example. Just this year, San Francisco banned the use of facial recognition technology by their city government. And they did this because there was discrimination towards women and people of color in their data set. But again, it's more difficult with someone who has a disability. If they didn't have women and people of color in their data set, they probably did not have people with disabilities in their data set. Disabilities are so varied. And when it comes to things like facial recognition, anyone whose face is not standard, right? They have a facial deformity. They have cerebral palsy. They have a cleft lip. The facial recognition is more likely to flag them as problematic when it's just their disability. Just a couple more examples. If some jobs will have a test that someone has to take to test their skills for the job. And oftentimes, how long it takes them to do that test is part of the assessment. And you've got someone who maybe needs to use assistive technology. They have a learning disability that causes them to read more slowly. They have a physical disability where they can't type the answer or move the mouse as quickly. And they're going to get lower rated. That has nothing to do with their ability to do the job or their knowledge. In addition to it being difficult to make generalizations about people with disabilities, a lot of people with disabilities do not disclose it. So because there is discrimination, there's a lot of discrimination towards people with disabilities. So if they can hide it, say when they're applying for a job, they're not going to put that on their resume because of discrimination. That happens with employers thinking that they're going to be more expensive or they're not going to be able to do the job as well. So you can't even look at the resumes and say, okay, we want to make sure that we have representative people with disabilities in our resume pool because they're not going to tell you, most likely. The extra effort that it would take to try to be inclusive is probably going to be outweighed by the desire and the need to do rapid development of the algorithms and getting the data out there fast. And people with disabilities are probably going to have outlier data, and outlier data is usually excluded from the data sets. So it's not as bleak as I'm sounding, because there are things you can do. I mean, the big thing is that this has not been researched extensively. So it's a great opportunity for anyone that wants to get some publications and do some research in this area. In fact, last year, I think it was, Western Sydney University got a grant for $700,000 to investigate artificial intelligence and how it can ensure equality for people with economic, social, and cultural inclusion, make sure that there's inclusion. I didn't say that very well. To make sure there's inclusion for people with economic, social, and cultural differences that also have a disability. So there's money out there, and there's the opportunity to really make a name for yourself in this area if you want to research it. Some other things that you can do, don't rely solely on AI to make important decisions, like who's qualified for a job, or who to fire, who's a credit risk, who's likely to commit a crime. Like, that's just one piece of data. You need to take other things into consideration and not depend totally on the AI, especially if it's something that might not apply to a marginalized group. Also, as you were saying before, these are all created by humans, right? So surveys, algorithms, the code, everything is created by humans. And the implementation, the use of that data is all done by humans. So we need to include people from diverse backgrounds, whether that is gender, race, or just different kinds of disabilities. They need to be included. They need to be consulted. Have them on the team, right? You need to include those groups consciously. And then my final recommendation is document, document, document. You need to document who was included in your test data, what assumptions have been made, what steps have you taken to try to recognize and minimize bias. So you need to ask the questions, you need to document, and do the research. So I am going to close with just letting you all know that I have created a list of resources if you want to read more about this, see more about what's going on and some of the issues. And they are on my website. It's like a shameless plug here, but it was the easiest place I could think to put them. So it's at bethcase.com. And right there on the front page, there's a blog post that includes a lot of references that I found as I was researching this.
Yeah, I mean, excellent. I mean, there's just so much good that you said there. I mean, just to recap, a couple of things is just like really paying attention to the technology and how we're making it. Because very often when we're testing things, we assume that we're making a technology that's universal. But if we don't actually test it on universal humans of many races, abilities, et cetera, we don't get a universal technology, and we get something that reinforces some of the bad stuff. So that's the downside. The upside is all of the people here who are interested in jobs and technology are going to have lots of work to do, and something that's going to impact people and their lives and how autonomous they can live. So I really, really love that response. Thank you so much.
So I guess to directly answer your question, if I had the money and I could do whatever, I would do this research.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Linda.
Thank you so much, because you did a wonderful job of segueing right into human resources. And so that's what I'm representing on the panel today. In this center, we would have to populate it, right? We would have to hire folks to help in the work of researching as well. And so what I want to do is take a step back for a moment, because when we think of human resources, oftentimes we think of very transactional kinds of responses. And much of what we're trying to do now in HR is move towards a strategic business partner. And so we would have been at the table when this design of this facility would have been talked about. And we would have been a part of the research. We would have been a part of tying the roles of the individuals who we were trying to hire to the mission and the vision of the center. And so with that in mind, I just want to take you through the fact that human resources uses a lot of analytics already. And so when you think about talent acquisition, that's probably the first place that you go, because we look at resumes, which you talked about. We look at screening opportunities, and we use a lot of AI in those opportunities. We use them with performance management. And so when you think of how human resources uses AI and algorithms, we do that so that we can move from a more transactional kind of response to our human resources within the organization to a more strategic opportunity, so that we can be more human and relational to the people that we serve. And so when we think about how we're using those opportunities now, we use them in chatbots. We already use them for data aggregation. We take a lot of data in human resources. We look at retention. We also look at hire rates, how long it takes to hire someone. So we're constantly taking in a lot of data. But what we don't have is the time, oftentimes, to aggregate that data and to put it to the strategic initiative. So using AI is helpful because it allows us the time, right, to implement and also to then really serve those that we are here to serve. In selection, which is one of the areas, we do use it for recruiting. It helps us to look at individuals in their LinkedIn who have changed their status and who may be looking, and so, wow, that person might be a really good candidate for our new research center because they're interested. or someone who is just about to graduate with a master's degree, we go, woo, let's talk to Mia, right? So it helps us in places we can't see. It helps us to identify patterns. It helps us to identify opportunities that we as humans just don't have the capacity to do as quickly as our AI and other intelligences can do for us. It helps us with efficiencies. It helps us with being available 24/7. When we get off at 5 and we shut down, our AI allows some of those human resource activities to continue so that we can provide the service quickly to those who are in need. So as you can see, HR has used AI, and we found positive ways to integrate that into our work. But, right, you've talked about bias, and you did a really good job, because I was going to use that very same case to talk about how if the data set, right, isn't representative of the universe, then you're going to get different responses. And so we have to recognize one and then have a plan, right, to address that. And so I think it's really important that we make sure that folks who do have a disability, individuals who have various backgrounds, ethnicity, education, whatever, that we are as inclusive as we can be. But it's not a one-time, right? So the data set needs to be revisited. We need to make sure that as things change, we are making adjustments to the system. This idea of ethics, right, with AI and diversity and inclusion, really, it's about, and you said this very well, it's not the tool, right, that's a concern. It's the users and it's the folks that are building. So it's a tool. The technology is a tool. We have to be very careful of how we implement it and what the intention is in the implementation. So when we think about how, for example, not talent acquisition, but let's switch to talent management. We want to manage our talent, and right now with COVID, many supervisors are concerned about, is the work really getting done? And so we have an opportunity to watch people work and track their work. And we have to ask ourselves, is that the right thing to do? Just because we can do that, and what are the costs associated with that? And I'm not talking financial costs, I'm talking trust costs in doing that. And so just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. We have to ask ourselves, why are we collecting this data? And then what is our intention and how we plan to use it? And so just an example of how this might play out, if you have supervisors who are more around Theory X, in that there's a penalty that needs to be had for folks that are not working. People need a more external locus of control. They can't do this work without me being there. And there's this heightened sense of security or supervision, then we might see some uses of the technology and AI that are damaging and harmful and could be traumatic for individuals who we're supposed to serve. On the other hand, if you have a more open view or theory-wide view on performance, where folks do have an internal locus of control that's positive, and that is they're working for job satisfaction rather than for someone watching over them, and they have more of a self-directed approach, then the AI can be used in ways to help to reward the kinds of behavior that you want instead of penalizing the behavior that you want. And so when we think about motivation, that's just one example of how HR could use the technology, not in acquisition, but just maintaining, rewarding, and reinforcing. And so when we look at ways that ethics come involved, we have discussed bias. Trust is an area, and privacy. Those are areas within human resources that we need to watch for. In my opinion, and I'm going to share my bias here, human resources is the heart of the organization, right? We are here as a function, in many cases, to be the conscience of the organization, both for the employees, but also for the organization. And we provide a sort of nurturing when done right, to the organization to help it to grow, and that's what we want to do with our employees. Northouse said this, if leadership, it is leadership's job to set the culture that's based on ethical principles. We, like doctors, we didn't take a Hippocratic oath, but we do serve, and our idea is to serve and protect not only the individuals within the organization as employees, their growth and development, but also the organization. And so for me, again, I say to you that technology and its component parts is neither bad or good. It is how we implement it. It is a tool that can be used to benefit the individual, the employees, and their access, but also human resources by freeing up those activities that are more administrative so that we can be more strategic and more relatable.
Yeah, I mean, so much good stuff there too. There's a couple of things that I really love, which is just being aware of the metrics that we're using whenever we're evaluating people,
Yes.
right? And I loved your point about you could make a punitive system where you're focusing on negative things, or you could make something that's based on rewards.
Yes.
And the other thing that I just really love about this comment was the one thing about always being aware of how things are changing. And so if you think about social issues and the way they've evolved in this country or around the world, we weren't always aware of the things that we're aware of today. And so we can't just like rest on our laurels, I guess, whenever we get, you know, a diversity representative or an algorithm that accounts for one element of diversity. We have to constantly be aware and try and revise and try and make sure we're getting better. And I think I'm hearing that in your comment, and I really love these first two comments. So Ulfa, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me and for allowing me to express my perspective as someone who's coming from the other side, who's causing all of these issues and why we're on this stage making this debate, right? I come from a technological side, so I'm an engineer, I'm a computer scientist. I've actually been designing AI algorithms for several decades now, right? If I say more than that, I'll be revealing my age, which you can probably Google it. If I had, you know, a big amount of money to start a center that can make change in this area, I think the first thing I would probably do is hire Beth and Linda to help me out because, as I will try to express right here, it's really a big issue. And I'm talking about from the AI and machine learning, you know, algorithm design and use case perspective, right, specifically. And the reason for that is if we look at how AI works and its impact on society, right, you know, I like how Linda really expressed the need for AI in the human resources perspective, and also Beth mentioned, you know, the need for captioning at the same time. If you want something live, you know, that can scale up with, I guess, if you have many talks going on, you know, let's say I'm trying to imagine, you know, conference or Davos or something like that, right, Davos. You know, AI itself is not evil, obviously, right? It's not even a necessary evil. It's just a tool, right? It's just a tool, just like you can have, you know, education is good, right? But, you know, we've all had, occasionally, like you had a teacher who cannot convey, you know, the material, you know, maybe, you know, for some reason, or can be biased, right, for many reasons. Medicine is good, right? But medicine can harm you also. It has side effects. Cars are good, but you can, you know, get in accidents and so on. I mean, anything we can imagine, you know, is good, but it can cause harm. Social media, social networks, you know, they were supposed to make us more connected, but somehow, you know, we have read recent news about how they can also be very, very harmful, especially in spreading, you know, misinformation and even causing polarization and filter bubbles, and so on, right? Same thing with AI. So recommender systems are extremely necessary. Nowadays on e-commerce and entertainment, you can't possibly be able actually to know everything that's out there, right? We needed the search engine, we needed the recommendation systems, right, to help us sift through all the, you know, the millions and billions of options out there, right? And it's used in education as well, and so on. But then on the other hand, you know, recent research has shown how they can also hide information, right? And that's just it was kind of like an implicit side effect. Of course, it was not explicitly coded, right? And so there is a lot of, I think there is a lot of hype out there in trying to see AI as this dangerous, monster that's going to eat us. So one of the things that I would probably like to do in my center is educate people about, myth versus fact, as in almost every one of these contexts. That's why context is very, very important. As, all of us here, I guess, have, represent the context from different perspectives. But also, I would probably like people to understand the different stages of machine learning algorithm design. Because what's making AI so powerful and maybe so scary right now is really the recent developments and advances in machine learning algorithms. Not like old-fashioned AI, which is mostly like knowledge representation and so on, and rule-based expert systems. So what are the different stages? And some of us, have mentioned here, like the data, of course, right? So much bias that lies in the data itself, right? So there is data, typically data collection and using the data cleaning, preparation, and then machine learning algorithm design. This is where we train the algorithms, right, to learn from the data to predict labels, let's say, what's the credit risk or recidivism risk or, a diagnosis in healthcare, or whether you'll be interested to see, something on social media or not. The next thing is, interpreting the output, right? So an algorithm is just going to give you an output, right? It's up to you to how to interpret it, how to evaluate it, and then what you're going to do based on it. So decision making, right? And so a lot of times, if you think about where the machine learning and AI designers, the algorithmic people are, they're somewhere between the data, like just the data has been collected in general, right? And then the final stage where an algorithm spits out an output, right? Where humans, users of those algorithms are, typically is before the data is collected and while it's being collected, but it's interfacing with the data and also interfacing with the last stage, which is the use case, interpretation and decision making, right? And I believe that where we have blind spots in mitigating these problems, right, in AI fairness, is trying to see it as a closed loop, right? So where do human users, everybody, literally everyone, in the future is going to probably be using AI at some point or another, no matter what sector of the economy, right, or society. And so how to interface with the data, knowing where the data came from, and then also how to interface between the, the decision, the output and the decision making, and how it feeds back to that data, right? And in order to do that, I'm a firm believer that we need to educate both the AI designers, right, the tech people, as well as human users of AI in all the sectors. And I know this is big, but it's an education mission, right? And in order to do that, we will need to tell them about the stages of machine learning and AI algorithm, the pipeline. People call it the AI pipeline. Some people call it the data science pipeline, right? It's the typical standard, usually 3 or 4 steps, right? Big steps. And then also how this loop works. And in order to do that, we need to know something about the context in which the AI algorithms are being used. So knowing something about society, about ethics, about history, psychology, the different kinds of human biases. I believe that if people knew more about these, these issues, which are completely outside algorithms, right? So pre-algorithmic biases, I would call them the pre-algorithmic, pre-AI biases. Once we know about those, right, we would be better able to both understand better the limitations of data and the dangers in data and data collection, and also in the decision-making process. For example, how unfairness can occur, in terms of metrics. So knowing about the fairness metrics, things like, the different group imparity or unfairness in false alarms. Typically, this is like one of those standards, right? Different kinds of adjusted entropy measures. These are all technical things, but they have specific meaning in their impact, right, on people's lives, like in screening. So I would try to have, obviously trying to break the silos most likely between many different disciplines, because I would need to have educators from many different disciplines, not just people who work on diversity and bias, people who work on history, because there are historical injustices that led to those biased data, right? Data sets. And then also, algorithmic people like me, the people I educate all the time, and how these things work together. And hopefully we'll have a research component, because I believe if we bring all these people together under one roof, we'll be able to not just educate, but also mitigate, right? So we will be able to create better systems and better algorithms.
Yeah, again, really great comments. And from this, from what you were saying, it's like just being conscious of the entire process. The humans in collecting the data, the humans in interpreting the data, and then I love how you're saying how those interact. These things are dynamic processes, they don't just stop. And then the other thing that I really like is the interdisciplinarity that you're kind of espousing here. One of the things that I heard the keynote talking about was just the variety of majors of people that could participate in something like the data science field, right? And you're saying different people with different perspectives and different training can contribute to this entire process. So I think that's fascinating. I'm glad that we had a technical person who can kind of help us, because like ethics is kind of a soft skill, right? But yeah, you have the technological stuff, and I really appreciate the comments on development and helping us to consider how to actually do those things and not just have pie in the sky stuff like philosophers are usually doing. Yeah. Mia.
All right, thank you all for having me here today to kind of talk from a student perspective. First thing that comes to mind for me is when I talk to my family and my close friends about what I'm studying, data analytics, what I do, data engineering, they kind of just shake their heads and smile, like, oh, that sounds interesting. But they really don't understand it in the way that they understand what a doctor does, and like a doctor's impact on the world or a lawyer's impact on the world. So for me, the first thing that came to mind was just education. Educating everyone that anyone can do this, and educating everyone that data is everywhere and it's used in everything. No one is isolated from data, from its usage, and from the consequences of it being collected. We blindly consent to things all the time, and knowing that that data then affects what we do later. Like on social media, you add a friend, well, that friend that you added just affects how an algorithm is going to associate potential other friends on social media. So even things just as small as that, we interact, we use, we generate data all day long. I have a million devices in my backpack right now. I have my phone, my computers, and all those different things, and they're collecting data almost constantly about me and the way I interact with the world. So for me, one of the first things I would want to do is help the layman. Someone who's not a technical expert, we're always talking to non-technical experts. They're experts in something else, but maybe not so much the data process, about what we do with the data, how we can construct it as an engineer so that they can use it for whatever process they want to use it for. So being able to kind of break down what I actually do and explain that, I feel like for me personally, to a younger audience, so when they get older, they have a better understanding, and they also know about this career path as well. That's one of the things that I would really want to focus on as far as bringing technology. If I had an endowment to play with, that would be one of the things that I would want to focus on, is bringing technology to everyone, understanding what data is, how it works, how it's collected, how it can be used, how it can be leveraged to help. I think that would be where I want to focus most generally.
Yeah, I love that, and it's echoing some of the other points about education. So that reminds me of the Ulfa point of making sure to like talk about the myths, like the stuff that scares us. But I also like this general thing of how is anyone going to know what any of this means if we don't teach them?
Exactly.
Right? And this isn't a new problem. This has happened with a lot of technologies in the past. Just think about things like driving, which I'm sure most of us did to get here today, or using a cell phone or whatever. All of these things took general education, and they would blow people's minds to a certain extent, like they had no exposure to it in previous generations. But looking forward, right, I am one of these lay people that you're talking about that needs more education, and I love that you have that public-facing sort of thing where you're trying to make sure that we understand what we're doing. One thing that this kind of reminds me of, and might be a silly example, is like some of my students really love TikTok. I don't know if you know this, but one of the common phrases is, you know, I ruined my algorithm. They'll just be really frustrated. I ruined my algorithm because they liked the wrong video, and it starts recommending all of the stuff that they don't like, right? And that's just like an innocuous interaction that suddenly affects a ton of other stuff, and that's just like TikTok, right? That's not even including, you know, whatever data social media is collecting on us. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
No problem.
So I guess one question that I want to ask the panelists, and I didn't give you all heads up on this, obviously. I just heard the keynote just really emphasizing soft skills and critical thinking and that kind of stuff. And so just in a broad sense, what are some of the qualities that you like in a person who works with you on things like this? So for example, humility, right? Because you cannot approach some of these talks, whenever you're talking about race or gender or whatever else, if you clam up and you just like are really afraid of being wrong and not addressing these things, it's just not going to be a good sort of deal, right? Or just like a willingness to get better. Are there, I mean, maybe this is a more HR oriented question, Linda, maybe you can start us off, I don't know. But yeah, what are the kinds of things that you would like look for in other people, or how do you approach your own research to make sure that you're doing these things that you're hoping that you can do? Does that question make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. I think that immediately when you ask the question, I'm thinking empathy, right? We need to definitely have that in our back pocket. Just to even come to the table, we need an open mindset that we don't know everything, and what we do know can be expanded upon. And I think he ended with self-awareness, which I think is critical, particularly to any type of leader in leadership that's looking to expand in this center and other places. Those are things that I would certainly recommend that we put in our back pocket and that we are able to act on. And I just, you know, again, showing my worldview, I believe we're here to help serve other people, right? And it's not just about us. And so if we don't empathize with how that data is going to be used and how it's going to affect other people, what are those consequences, then, you know, we're already off the road a bit. And so those would be the things that I would, if I had to pick three right off the bat, that's what I would say, being empathetic, right? Having an open mindset and being totally self-aware. And that self-awareness is just about how you fit into all of this and how you respond to the world, and, you know, remembering your responsibility to not just yourself, but to others.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I mean, I'm curious, Ulfa, because you've done some big projects. Like my introduction was pretty humble, but you have a lot of experience in this. What have been some traits that you think that have helped you to succeed and do these kinds of things? Just stay up on data algorithms. What sort of drives you forward in some of these things? Do you have any indication? Is it just curiosity, just seeing where this goes?
Two things, maybe three things. One is curiosity, right?
Yeah.
And that is something that a lot of scientists really have. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not, I'm not, you know, and many of us, not just scientists, you know, artists have it, you know, teachers and learners, but just being curious, right? So I remember back in, you know, before people were talking about this fairness in AI, I was like, you know, looking at, because I work on recommender systems, right? And then I started reading about filter bubbles, and I said, you know, there has to be, you know, a way we can measure this, right? How can we do this, like scientifically, you know? Because we talked about myths and facts, right? I can't do anything with myths, you know. I need to be able to measure things because I'm a quantitative person, right? If I'm gonna go to my community, right, in my tech community and convince them about something, I can show them metrics and they'll understand that, right? And models. And so I remember actually I wrote a grant, and also being not afraid of risk. We don't like risk in general. We don't like to be disappointed and crushed when we because you're talking about we talked about funding, right? I actually wrote a proposal to National Science Foundation. This was in I think I started working on it maybe 2013, right, with a colleague of mine from cognitive science, and we got it rejected at first, and then we got it, we worked on it a little bit, showed some preliminary data, and we got it funded. So it was actually on a feedback loop bias in recommendation systems. And now we're like 5 years later, after we got the funding, and we have some results. We have models, mathematical models that show that the recommender systems can lead to bias, and they can lead to hiding information, and that it can get amplified and gets worse and worse. And both mathematically, theoretical, theoretical models, as well as empirical experiments that show that, right? And that these are things that have been published recently, and also working on transparency. So, how can we make black box models, which are by definition opaque, how can we make them transparent? That's like an oxymoron, right? Right? But maybe you can approach it from a different perspective. So before we started working on this, people thought that there is always a trade-off. You're going to sacrifice. If you're going to have more transparency, you're going to sacrifice accuracy of prediction, right? Yeah. And that is why everybody now is using deep learning, because they're so powerful, right, at prediction. But then we showed, and other people have showed, that you can actually have a win-win. It's not true, right? That was a myth. And I remember very well, we were like submitting our papers at the beginning, and people were saying, well, you can't be gaining both accuracy and transparency at the same time, right? And we were like scratching our heads too, both myself and my students. Maybe there's something wrong. We go back. But sometimes when you improve transparency in general, what you're going to do is you're actually changing the algorithm. So there is no reason why the algorithm is not going to change. So there are different, we can talk about that maybe, in another, if we had more time, but transparency specifically. How do you build transparency? There are different ways to do it. Either you change the algorithm, or you attach, like an explainability model, for example. Those are like 2 steps, right? If you just attaching an explainability model, then your transparency is actually not really transparent, because you're not necessarily explaining the algorithm. Right? You're kind of creating a parallel algorithm, but if you change the algorithm, you are changing the algorithm, so it can change to anything you want, right? So you can, change it so that it's also more accurate, right? So I go back to the question, right? So curiosity, right? Being, again, taking the risk of failure, it's very, very important, because you're going to fail at the beginning. We don't know anything. We don't know squat about ethics, right? Who are we? The technical people. That humility is also about our disciplinary limitations. Is going out and learning from people from different disciplines. Reading, I did spend a lot of time reading across the disciplines, reading about, historical injustices, about bias, and so on, and I learned a lot from it, and then I shared that and tried to make sure and create a momentum in my research group for people to learn about these issues, that we're not just technologists, right? You need to go outside your comfort zone, basically, be able to take risks, and also to learn something new, and be humble that you have no idea about it, and then start trying to look at the closing the loop. Yeah. I would think that, and I agree with what Linda also said, like it has to do also with the growth mindset. Mm-hmm. I think all of these things probably have to do with the growth mindset. Yeah.
I think that's really wonderful. As good as the technology might be, we still have to have human interaction with it. Yes, we do. And so it's the qualities that y'all are bringing up that help us to become better humans in order to interact with the technology, and hopefully make the technology so that it can interact with us and improve our lives, I guess. So I don't know if Beth or Mia want that.
I'd like to chime in on that. Yeah. What you were talking about with transparency and what you were mentioning about empathy, to me, go hand in hand. You have to be able to think about the end user. You have to be able to think about the person who will be affected on the other side to even consider transparency. Mm-hmm. So for one thing that we did in our program, we did a model competition, and we ran a bunch of different types of models, and we pretty much kept getting the same things were important over and over again. Now, we sacrificed 3% accuracy, and we used a simpler model that was easier for our end user to use and understand on their own, because that was what was important to us. All of our models were giving us similar results, but at the end of the day, it's not about being the most correct if no one understands what's going on. If I give you something and say, you're gonna get you, $1 million tomorrow, you're still gonna ask, well, how? And if I can't tell you how, then that's a problem. So for me, being empathetic is also very much related to being transparent. And I definitely think if I were, you know, talking to anyone who was interested in this field, that would be on the top of my list, especially when it concerns ethics, is being able to make sure that what you are doing is easily understood by the person who's going to be using it. And also for me, critical thinking would be the other skill. Being able to sit down and think about a problem, and you're going to get frustrated and you're going to walk away from it. You're going to come back and you're going to see a comma out of place, and that's all the issue ever was. But being able to be critical about what you're doing, and also being able to be okay with making mistakes. I have ran and written thousands of lines of code, and I make a mistake still to this day that is so simple, and I always laugh at myself when I do it. So it's just being able to kind of take the good with the bad and be okay when things go wrong, because they will.
So I love this example of accuracy, right? There are these things that are just sort of, I guess, implicit or taken for granted in what we want, I guess, whenever we're developing technologies. Accuracy, for example.
Yeah.
But that doesn't help us to evaluate whether we should be striving for accuracy as the primary value, right? Because there's so many other things, how the user helps to understand things.
Yeah.
And I can't remember, I think it might have been you or Linda, maybe or might have been Beth, I don't know, but about like the bank loan algorithms, right?
Yeah.
And you can just factor so much into that. And for example, if you're not measuring, you know, whether the money is staying in the community or which families it's helping to improve, that's like data that you could include in it, but presumably, I mean, just because those things can be incredibly biased, maybe they're not including that. And so I really love that you're saying, look, just be honest to what values you're looking for, and then step back and evaluate whether that's actually what needs to be looked for, right? That's kind of what I'm hearing there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the only thing I would add, because they stole all the ones in my head, the only one that I would sort of add is creativity.
Okay.
And not doing things the way that they've always been done just because that's the way they've always been done. Or that's how you were taught, and we were talking about this earlier, that's how you were taught in school. You know, education may be sometimes a little bit behind the times in implementing new concepts and new ways of doing things. Not to criticize education. But if you've been taught how to do something and then you go to the job and it's always how they do it, you have to be creative it gets back to being open-minded and to being, and all the stuff that you guys said, but sometimes you have to be creative in how could this be done differently? And be willing, as someone mentioned, to keep learning, right? So yeah, just to be able to step back and to think about things differently and to ask yourself, how could I do this differently, and not just the way that we've always done it.
It's so crucial. This is like, so I teach ethics, obviously, philosophy, and usually one of my day one or maybe day two lessons is about confirmation bias, because just the innate tendency of us to keep thinking the things that we already think and only look for the data that proves us right. And it's really painful. I guess you get good at being humiliated whenever you're a philosopher because we say some really weird things. But the painful process of trying to prove yourself wrong, right? And especially whenever you're an expert. So like the more credentials you have, just like, well, of course I should be an expert in this, but then you make like a silly mistake, kind of like what Mia is saying, who's coded and run thousands of lines of programming, right? But that's just what you have to do, and that's how we get better, and that's just part of the process. And also it's like, I find that a lot of people don't really mind. It's actually like more detrimental to an organization if you don't have that quality in you and you can't just like try and hopefully improve in those ways. Yeah, I don't know if we're getting ready for the Q&A or beginning to transition, but yeah, about 5 minutes, and then we'll go toward that. So I guess maybe as a transition to the Q&A, are there any challenges in your field or whenever you were thinking about this question of having an endowment for your center that really maybe not inspire maybe, but like motivate you? Like what is one puzzle that you just can't put down? So like something that, I wouldn't say it keeps you up at night, but an idea that you keep coming back to that you think is going to influence how we interact with technology, right? Because it's about ethics and technology, and I'm just kind of wondering, what element of technology just kind of like fascinates you and that you want to give more attention to? So maybe it's returning to the original question a little bit. So I don't know if anyone would like to start. I see some like some thinking looks on all your faces, but
Guess I'll jump in. I think making sure that we use it in the right way and that it's not, that it's used with authenticity, right? And so that we make sure that it's not a tool that's used without a purpose, right, and an intention. And so we have many things that we can use AI for that don't really matter at the end of the day, you know what I mean? And so it can make things easier, but again, going back to your point, you know, how has it advanced what we're trying to accomplish? And are we measuring the right thing? Are we paying attention to the right thing? And so I go back to Beth's comment about, you know, we've done it this way, is this the way we've always done it? That's an organizational issue by far, and I think that when we hear that in HR, we want to say, but what if, right? And so that's what design thinking tells us to do, and taking a look at this pen and going, yeah, it's a pen, and it does this, and we've always used it that way, and we go, well, what if you turn it this way? What could it be, and how could that help the organization even more? So those are the things that keep me up, is how can we address that this is the way we've always done it? Because that's sometimes what stops anyone from using AI and accepting that, is because we've always done it this way. We've always collected every single performance evaluation on paper, by hand, right? And so we're saying, well, what if we turned it around just a little bit and we used this technology? Couldn't we do it a lot faster? And couldn't the conversation with the employee be much richer? What if we did it a different way, right? So design thinking is how do I work that into HR in such a way that we redesign the way we work and that AI is a complement to that. So when someone figures that out, let me know. You got an algorithm for that?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
no, but I love that because I think that's one of the big general concerns with technology, right? Balancing that cautious, critical thinking concern, because that slows things down, right? Slows things down, with also just like maybe the curiosity that Ulfa was talking about, the humility, the creativity, of seeing if we can do things better.
Right.
Because I mean, like that's at the heart of justice. Some people, whenever they're fighting for justice, they're a little trepidatious because at least with what we have today, we kind of know what we're getting, right? We don't know what the future is going to be like. But if that's what we did, we wouldn't make any big advancements on pretty much any issue, right? And the same sort of thing with technology, which is kind of what I'm hearing here. What if we changed up how we do this HR process? And sometimes it doesn't work, but other times it leads to a huge improvement, right? And that's really incredible. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that. Beth?
I think the thing that is on my mind, and I don't have a solution for it, but it's on my mind, is privacy. Because, I mean, I talked specifically about people with disabilities, but a lot of the issues that I talked about are also an issue for women, or people of color, or other, disenfranchised minority groups. And, I mean, there was a research project where they submitted the exact same resume with either an Anglo-sounding name or an ethnic-sounding name.
Right.
And and everything else was exactly the same, and found that the person with the Anglo-sounding name got the interview, whereas the ethnic-sounding person did not. They've also done that with gender, with a female name and a male name, and found that with the exact same resume, the males got the interview more than the women. So I think when you're collecting your data on whatever it is, that people may have a tendency to not to want to reveal that information, to not necessarily want to identify what their gender is or what their heritage is or if they have a disability. So we may not even know how much of these groups are being included in that data. So I guess my concern is like, how can we get that kind of information so we can make sure that the algorithms are representative while maintaining the privacy of the people providing us the data? And I don't know how we do that. But I guess that's kind of like a big picture issue that I have is that, we're talking about trying to make your test data representative of the population. But how do you know if you're achieving that if people won't tell you that information? So.
Yeah. And I've noticed that there's like even differences between countries, right? So I spent a year in Germany as a Fulbright, and one thing that people are kind of like, Americans are horrified by over there, is whenever you're submitting a resume, you submit like a portrait, which like some of my HR friends are like, what? Like what? That's like the opposite of what we're trying to do. Like we want to be as objective as possible. And so, Germany is like obviously a super industrialized country and has lots of stuff, but that's just like a simple practice that can happen. And if you're working with a team that's in multiple countries, sometimes you have to have these conversations like how do we select for the right kind of candidate or whatever else. So I think we're beginning to get some questions, but I definitely want to leave some space for Olfa or Mia if you want to add anything to these concerns as far as issues that you keep coming back to. You can't get them out of your mind.
For me, an issue that I can't get out of my mind, which I have no solution for it presently, would be bias in search engine algorithms. For me, if I want to find a new hairstyle, every time, braids, black women. Because if I don't, then the hair that's going to come up doesn't look like my hair, and I can't achieve that style. So for me, that has been one of the best things about getting into this world, talking about ethics, talking about bias, has done for me is just being able to walk into a space and say that out loud, because I know so many people who deal with those kind of biases, just as simple as a Google search, trying to find someone on Google who looks like them and what they're searching. So don't have a solution for it presently, and I know that it's a work in progress. It's being addressed in a lot of cases, and what we see on those kind of search engines and things like that. But that is one of the things that probably keeps me up at night more than anything else, is just making sure whenever it's my turn to design anything, whenever it's my turn to put anything together, is that I am being inclusive in what I'm using to train on, so that, when the test comes, when the person actually inputs their data or does their Google search, that it's not me on the other end who is the person where you have to specify things that maybe shouldn't have to be specified when searching.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Olfa?
Yeah, I'll add something just as a follow-up to what Beth mentioned about privacy, right? So there is an area actually in machine learning which is called privacy preserving data mining, where it's specifically about designing algorithms that, take into account privacy, but try to achieve as good an accuracy as possible, as if you had that data, but the private data, but you're hiding it. But I am not sure they are really looking at fairness also. So that is actually
It still does
challenge.
depend on the
Yeah,
person
and an
self-disclosing it.
Yes.
Or, so, yeah. It's
And
nice to know they're looking at it, though.
And I also, chime in with what Mia said, who, by the way, I would love to recruit into my center too, right? Because she's going to be on my side of things, the tech person with empathy and everything. I need a team member. And what Mia mentioned also, and all of us really have been talking about also, is like, how to be able to forecast unfairness ahead of time in a totally open world, right? Obviously, the Google search engine designers didn't put in that bias explicitly, right? But it's there, right? So how to, engage the user somehow in the design process, maybe, and also how to conduct experiments. For me, that's what sometimes keeps me awake. How do I conduct experiments that don't cause further harm, but still allow me to model bias and unfairness and how to mitigate them, right, and so on. It's really hard. So often we have to resort to simulations because that's the only ethical way to do it, actually. You can't just unleash an algorithm. you know, and
Right.
see, oh yeah, let's see how it's going to happen. I mean, people do it in the e-commerce world, but you can't do it in every context. You know?
Yeah.
I want to pull out something that she
Go
said
for
and
it.
emphasize it, because I'm not sure that it was as strong as I would like people to get. There is bias, but it's not intentional. Like,
Yeah.
people
Right.
aren't purposefully creating biased algorithms. And I think that that's important, because it could I could see people getting defensive and being like, well, I didn't do, well, yeah, nobody does it on purpose. So I just she said that, but I wanted to pull it out and bring attention to that the data may be biased, but that doesn't mean the people doing it are, right? So
Yeah.
not accusing anybody.
No, it's huge. It's huge. And like whenever you talk about systemic injustice or systemic problems, one of the facts that's really hard for people to wrap their minds around is how a system with really good people, like people that you eat dinner with, and like you go to birthday parties or whatever else, they end up creating something that's really biased and has bad effects. And sometimes that just happens, right? But that's part of why we have to maintain that critical look on our own work to make sure that we're not perpetuating these sort of bad things that are happening. I also want to we haven't really talked too much about law or regulation, but anyone out there who's thinking of law school, these issues are huge because in order to make competent laws where you're actually going to be able to regulate people, you have to be thinking of these issues and maybe have some sort of tech background to where you actually understand how something like this would be enforced. So we have some questions, and I kind of want to ask the first two because they kind of go hand in hand, and so I'm just going to give you a real quick set of questions. And so the first couple questions basically are addressing something similar, and they say, can the panel address the importance of diversity and representation in data sets, such as with facial recognition system? And the second question is, how can the University of Louisville work towards anti-racism within data sets, and how can our faculty and departments support this? So basically trying to think about diversity and representation in data sets and with the active goal toward anti-racism. Is there any sort of practical advice that you could give to faculty or departments? Because it seems as though our audience would have some questions about that.
I'm not a data scientist, so I will say, so from the practical applied perspective, I may not be the best person to answer this, but I thought I had something to say. I mean, there is the inclusion for one part. When you're sampling, when you're testing out facial recognition, are you testing out a lot of different faces, different shades of colors, different faces? Are you testing, including people who have Down syndrome? Are you including people who have cerebral palsy and that have burn victims, to include that in your data set? But then I think what a lot of it is it's not just can you recognize that person, but it's what's associated with it. So again, another study I read, whereas they were doing a facial analysis on people to see who might be a recidivism risk after being released from jail, and of course, the dark-skinned people tend to be reported as a higher risk. So I think it's not just the facial recognition, but what's going along with that. How is that being put together? But again, with the disclaimer that I'm not a computer science or data science person, from a technical perspective, I don't have an answer. Would you like to answer? Do you have any insight on that?
I would say that I would try to reframe the question a little bit, right?
Sure.
Like what data sets? First of all, it's very rare that you will see departments having these kind of data sets and using them, let's say, for proctoring exams and stuff. That's not what universities or institutions in general have. The companies that are being contracted to do the work, usually they have them, right? That's how it happens. And so it's not as much the departments themselves, let's say for, proctoring exams, as really interrogating the companies and making sure there is a certain level of transparency in disclosing the distribution, the demographic distributions within their data sets that they used for training, for example. It's the same thing we would probably demand maybe from search engines, right? Yeah. And I believe it is our human right. I personally believe that we are way behind the times when it comes to how tech is conforming with human rights, and Europe is way ahead of us. I mean, I'll mention, if we want to look at where we should go, right, approximately, and maybe hopefully do better, right, because Europe has its own context. It's not the same as the United States, look at the historical injustices are totally different, the demographics, right, and so on. So look at the generalized data protection regulation, GDPR, right? And then also something that's upcoming, actually, they're working on something called the Artificial Intelligence Act, AIA, I believe. That's, I think the bills are literally being written right now. Mm-hmm. So, and I have no doubt that Europe is gonna move into that, and that is where so the transparency, we looked at the transparency of the outcome, right? There's like black box algorithms. We all realize the danger of black box algorithms, right? We need to see why something has been predicted that way. But also the transparency of the data distributions. That's something that's total black box. We don't know on which training data, algorithm has been used, has been trained, and also what kind of, historical caused or demographically caused, disparities and unfairnesses are hidden in that data. Sometimes you can't know that. In many cases, especially in crime and, credit loans, even in education and screening, especially, like the Amazon example, you need to know, first of all, what exists out there. It's all like historical and social science, I would believe. So it's a big Pandora's box. That question was really.
So is this would the recommendation be like just being, I guess, having more conversations with whoever you're getting the data from, and making requests? I mean, maybe demands if you're in the position, but I don't know. But requests that they be inclusive in whatever data they're giving you to work from. Is that kind of the suggestion?
Yes, and also sharing the distribution of that data, right? The breakup of the subjects, let's say, if they use subjects in
Great.
data.
And I think it's not just asking them to be more inclusive because, as you said, a lot of the data is historical.
Yeah.
And so it is what it is. Right. But it goes back to my recommendation of document, document, document. If when they provide you the data set and that they can say, where, again, transparency, where did it come from, right? Who was included? How did you get this data? That at least then, even if you have a biased set of data, because that's all you've got to work with, data's historical, right? That you can then be aware of how it's applied.
Gotcha.
Right. So I think it would be great if you could request people and say, yes, I want the data you give me should be representative. That would be awesome. But a lot of this data is historical, or it's a byproduct of something else. So I think it goes back to the transparency and documentation of where the data came from and who was included in it. So with the awareness that there's a good chance it's biased, but at least now I know what the bias is.
So
Linda, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to say too, off of OFA's recommendation, that particularly if we are using a selection firm, instead of doing the selection planning and process within house, is that you do ask for those sorts of things so that you understand what your data set is and who is at that time, who is it looking at, because that will definitely impact how you interpret that data and how you apply it. So that would be one example that I can think of within HR right off the bat.
Okay. Yeah, so make requests where you can, but
Yes.
also just be aware of the bias. So, I mean, it's like we keep using this metaphor of the tool. If the tool does one thing, right, you just have to know what that thing it is that it's doing, and not like think that it's doing something it's not. Yeah, okay. Mia, I don't know if that was
for
you're
me,
gonna add?
I would say transparency is a huge part of it, but it's also something that sometimes you can't control. I know that U of L had sent out a request for people to come get screened for like COVID antibodies, even before the vaccines start rolling out, just to see who had previously had it. And my mom received one of the little survey papers, but no one else in like our immediate like neighbors got it. So if she participates, she is a representative, for a particular area, but our neighbors don't look exactly like us on either, on any side. So for me, it was one of those things that that's kind of eye-opening. You want your data set to be random, but even still, whoever you sent that out to may not reply. You're not going to expect every person that you sent it out to blindly to reply. And the people who reply may already present a type of bias in the data set that you just can't control because you were doing your best to get a random selection. But of that random selection of people in the population you chose to reach out to, only a certain amount or a certain type of person will respond. So sometimes with data sets, it's the person designing the experiment may be trying to account for certain things, but they don't have complete control over who is in that data set. And that is a really hard thing. And I don't know if it would be a good idea to put on something, oh, we want you to do it because you may represent a part of a population, because then that's going to skew the type of results you get. So it is really hard when you're trying to do like clinical trials or certain types of data that everyone can't fall into. I can't do cancer research without someone having cancer. And so knowing how like a particular drug may affect them, they have to be in a certain stage to be in the experiment. Those kind of things are not designed to hurt anyone or designed to create issues with the data that present these type of biases that you see with like facial recognition or lack of diversity or inclusion. It's just sometimes a byproduct that we just unfortunately can't control.
I wanted to connect 2 points that they made. Beth, you said early on that sometimes including folks that have a disability, but them not wanting to disclose, I think connects with what you're saying in terms of people, once we reach out or once someone reaches out, you have to reach back or else right then our data set may be affected.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to find a way to increase trust in what we're doing that people don't understand so that we can get better at what to help them understand in the product. So, reaching back out and being a part of the data set, I think is really going to be helpful in making what we do more accurate.
Right. And so like this is kind of related to clinical, I mean, you just gave a medical example, Mia. One of the things that I've seen healthcare workers or researchers in healthcare kind of do is think about the tangible things that would need to be taken care of in order to get diverse participants, right? So childcare, rides to and from a clinic or whatever, however you're collecting the data, but just the practical stuff because, if you don't make accommodations for even the practical stuff, depending on what kind of data you're gathering, you might unknowingly be narrowing in your data set in a way that isn't going to be compatible with your research. So I want to shift, I guess, topics a little bit. We have another question, and this question is, can the panel address the relationship between AI and human partners in the future of work? Do we humans still have a role to play in knowledge work in 20 years? So whatever direction y'all want to take that.
Gotta hope so.
I mean, if you had to make predictions, what do you think?
I would say for me personally, being in a business analytics program, we work with data. Data gives us information. Information helps us make models. Models gives us output. But that's it. That's all the model is going to do. It's not going to tell me from that output what the business should do. It's still kind of on the human to interpret that and give recommendations. So a big part of what we do in our program is talk to people who, are running the business. We're designed to help, CEO levels don't have time to think about how that data looked and what it's led to, but they want to know what do they need to do to drive their company forward. So for me, I think no matter what, interpretation, recommendations, and implementation is always going to be of human concern. No matter how advanced a model gets, the model is only as good as the person who built it, person using it, and the person interpreting it and delivering those results and deploying the results out into the world.
Ditto.
Yeah.
I'm like, mic drop on that.
Definitely.
Ulfa, are you wanting to add something there?
Yeah, I think that, again, this is probably something that can be addressed by really a much closer and deeper look at myths versus facts, right?
Sure.
Really, AI is actually pretty good at doing tedious tasks that are cognitively not very hard, actually, that are,
Right.
easy, can be automatable. Things like looking at the X-ray image and pointing out to tumors, stuff
Right.
like that. It's very repetitive. If you have to do it for I don't know how many X-rays, especially if you have to do it in a video, look at how many frames, right?
Yeah.
Radiologists have a lot of, but so AI, there is literature that shows some of the recent AI systems can do obviously faster work, but also more accurate work than experts, right? Where AI finds a challenge is in work that's not necessarily repetitive, actually, but is much more tedious. Actually, where a lot of cognitive load is needed. Creativity, problem solving, taking into account context, things, like in the moment, we humans can take into context. I know what Mia has just said. Maybe it brings up some, memories, things that I know also, maybe Linda, right? And so on, and that makes me possibly, think about things that I wouldn't have thought alone. So these are things that are really hard to pre-train in machine learning and AI models, which is why, creativity, art, even like problem solving that takes into account empathy. How do you encode empathy in an AI algorithm? Good luck with that. Right, so I believe that there is so much in our cognitive thinking as humans that depend on other things, not just our own experience, our lived experiences, what we know, our communication, like in real time, and also empathy, emotional intelligence, and so on, that is very, very hard to encode in AI. Anybody who tells you that they've done it is probably working with a toy data set or something like that. That's probably not true.
That makes sense that we can't really out-compute a computer, but we have a lot of other skill sets that just aren't in AI, I guess. Yeah. So 20 years is kind of like the recent future. So that's hopefully that helps answer that particular question. Okay, so here's a particular question, kind of like switching, and this question is for Dr. Nasraoui, and this person asks, can Dr. Nasraoui speak to the work of the Athena Advance Initiative, and more broadly for the panel, how can we as educators help to create a diverse data science workforce? Is this for me or for all of the panelists? For me in particular? Thank you. So how can let me ask that again. Dr. Nasraoui, speak to the work of the Athena Advance Initiative, I guess if you have anything to say on that, but more broadly for the panel, how can we as educators help to create a diverse data science workforce?
Okay. Yeah, I can talk about Athena a little bit. So I came here wearing my AI hat, right? I also have another hat. I wish I have, another one to wear right now, which is the the Athena Advanced Initiative. That's really, it's a different area there. So Athena is trying to look at the barriers facing women faculty, especially in the STEM disciplines, where equity barriers in general are more pronounced and more prevalent, and so on. So we're talking about, representation, so lack of women at faculty, lack of seeing, full professors, especially, women who make progress through their career and so on, advancement. as well as, trying, and so what are those barriers, right? And so one of the things that Athena is working on is trying to change the recruitment process, so the search and recruitment process, so that the process, obviously the recruitment and hiring process really has a lot of stages, right, in different facets, and any one of them can be affected by inequities, right? And so, let's say like unconscious bias, that's just one small thing, that's just the tip of the iceberg, even though a lot of people, unfortunately, are not conscious about it or maybe deny it actually. And there is literature that shows that a lot of people tend to deny that there is unconscious bias even after they've been shown the scientific evidence actually that it exists, literature and publications and so on and experiments. So that is one thing, but there are other, factors in the process. For example, using rubrics, taking the time, deliberating, and so on, diversifying the pool, right, and so on. So, that is one thing. The other thing is working on retention, and that is, for example, via mentoring, so better mentoring programs to help improve advancement. And underpinning all of this, obviously, are two pillars. First is education and awareness, and also data capture and transparency. So there is a big data part, data science, I would say data capture and science and monitoring as part of that, which underlies that. And this has to do mostly with, this is more, I would say that this is both an organizational equity and opportunity, problem or opportunity, and also a social justice problem, because having women, still disenfranchised, especially in the STEM disciplines. I mean, we know it in the AI and the technology field. Mia mentioned some of these things, like and Beth as well, right, and Linda. Like Amazon, most of the IT firms in Silicon Valley and elsewhere have a problem with retention of women and recruitment of women and advancement of women. So this is something, in the education field, this is also similar, and it's very, very important to have all of these different representations, all these different groups being represented and also belonging, right, and thriving, not just being tolerated, but thriving in an inclusive environment where they're empowered, which means they're not isolated, for example. So Athena works on the networking and the empowerment of women as well, right? And because especially for faculty, it's very, very critical, because the faculty are the ones in the end of the day who, show up and teach the students. So if we want to educate the future workforce, which is diverse, we need to have diverse role models, diverse perspectives, diverse, not just, ethnic backgrounds and experiences, but also thought, right, which has been shown to be better. So diverse teams actually thrive better. So, it is completely mixed in with social justice, workforce development, inclusion and education, right? And I think it serves everyone.
So I don't know if any of the other panelists wanted to add about that second part, which was how can we as educators help to create a diverse data science workforce? Any initial reactions to that?
I would say for me, it's awareness. I went to the University of Louisville as an undergrad student and received a math degree. And in that math degree, I was kind of wondering, where am I going to go next? For me, I started off wanting to teach math. And part of the reason why I wanted to teach math is I have never had a black woman as a math teacher or a black man. And that was something that, for a lot of students, I feel like you do what you see someone who looks like you, and you see that as a possibility. So for me, I've kind of always been great at math, but I know a lot of people are like, man, I'm never going to be good at it, and they felt that so deeply that it's not just like a conscious thought, it's an unconscious thought that drives that feeling. So for me, I feel like it's awareness, and I feel like it's representation as well. I know 2 women in this industry now. That's the second woman. who has a PhD. And for me, that's kind of disheartening. And as a student of the math department, Dr. Bradley was the only woman who instructed me as well. So it's just one of those things that I feel like it comes down to representation in STEM. Not that I, want us to upheave anyone's job and slide in women or slide in African Americans, but I do think when we're screening, we do need to be more conscious of that. And also, for me, it would have kind of been nice to have something like this taught a little bit sooner.
Yeah.
Every industry uses data. You could go into marketing and use data. You can go into, you could be a social media influence and use Google Analytics to, look at how your page is doing. No matter what you do or where you want to be in life, data is going to be involved. So I feel like being more aware of that earlier on, and I don't really know the best way to just create awareness about the issue of data existing and how it can affect you, but whatever that is to me would be the way to go, and more opportunities to learn or shadow. When I thought about what speed school would represent when I was looking at my undergrad degree, I had no idea computer science and computer engineering would be where I land one day. That what I actually do is more geared towards that, but I didn't see that for myself because I didn't know anyone who did it. So I hope to keep mentoring. I talk to a lot of prospective students, and one of the things I noticed is that on LinkedIn, a lot of the students who reach out to me who are interested are Black women, and I feel like they see me and maybe they feel, okay, I can maybe talk to her and maybe I can do it too, just because of that. I talk to all kinds of students, but I do know that's who slides in my DMs. So
Yeah.
that's important, I think.
So just the awareness
Yeah.
and putting people in positions where they can be seen and forming a community, I guess,
Yes.
are kind of the themes that I hear. I don't know if you were trying to say something, Linda.
And just agreeing right along with that. And so I too have another hat I can pull out, and that's a pre-K through 12 hat in in my teaching and leading in the schools. Starting early is so important. If you don't see the representation, it's counted as that's not an area for me, right? And so I think it's very important to start early, having women in science and technology speaking to groups. And I know that we're in this era now of COVID, but we can do forums like this where students are able to see a stage full of women, right, that are talking about things from a very different perspective. And I think that that's going to be very important. You mentioned mentoring, and that's important. When you know that there are cohorts coming in where there are students who might need extra support, that coaching and that mentoring is very important. And building a community where you feel safe and supported, and that's some of the work too, now putting back on my recruiting hat, that can happen in HR and can work with departments in partnership so that there are support systems in place so that you can pull together folks that look alike, who think alike, and so that you build this community, and then from that you broaden out to bring in other communities so that you create, so that you're not creating silos, but you are creating and reaching out across. But I do think it's important for young people to see various types of people in all kinds of walks of life and in all different kinds of careers, because there is a place for them at the table, and we just have to show them what that is for them.
Yeah, I think that's great. Beth, do you want to add something?
I think
No?
they've covered it.
Okay, good. So I mean, going off of that, I want to ask, like, do you have any general advice for allies? Because I'm assuming that a fair part of our audience isn't, necessarily they aren't women, or they aren't, transgender, or they aren't people of color or anything like that. Is there anything that maybe you wish you would see in allies more? Someone who is like just more run-of-the-mill, standard, status quo kind of person. What can they do to help promote something like diversity? Does that question make sense? What are some things that you'd like to see in people who want to move this forward but aren't members of these particular groups?
So from today's discussion, one thing that I realized is that students who have disabilities probably are still going to be have additional barriers that you can't account for. So that's something that I would like to start thinking about more personally. When I think about allyship, I think about doing what you would want someone to do for you who isn't you. So for me, thinking about people who have disabilities more and how, accessible technology is important, that is going to be a big drive for me personally moving forward as an ally to that community. And then also for students who maybe have language or cultural barriers, I feel like that is something that we also need to be conscious of. Certain holidays come around and, people have different customs and traditions. Just being aware of that and making sure you're not, putting strain on people or making requests of people that that they can't do or commit to during that time. That's something that I try to be conscious of as well. But.
I'm just thrilled. I'm just saying that I have reached somebody on this stuff, I think from the disability perspective, again, recognize that a specific individual does not represent an entire population. But to ask the questions, to listen to their opinions. If you've got, I mentioned before, as one of my recommendations is to include people from various backgrounds as consultants or in helping you develop something, even if you're, they're not a data scientist or whatever. It's just having someone you can talk to. And you can say okay, as a blind person, how would you access this? Or, and realizing that one blind person is not representing the experiences of every blind person out there, just like someone who's black is not representing every black person out there. But you have to ask, if you're not in that population, you don't know. So you have to ask the questions, and you have to listen to the answers.
Yeah.
So, I think that if we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and wanting allies, for me, understanding that diversity is much larger than a single person, as you just said. I don't represent all African American women. And so we've talked about recognizing that we want diversity, and diversity is good. In order for us to get to inclusion, we have to have some sort of recognition of who the individual is. I need you to see who I am, right? And I need you to see that I have a disability. I need you to see that I'm a woman of color and whatever else I want to disclose to you. But then once you've made that recognition, then listen, right? Include individuals, and not just at the table. We can have a beautiful array of people around the table, but if we're not including them and reaching out and listening to their voice, then we're right back to diversity with no recognition and they're not included. And so we can't get to equity and then ultimately justice without walking through all those things. And so I say lean in, listen and learn, find out what you can do. One individual, commit to that. And then once you do that, link with someone else and get something else done.
Yeah, so common themes in a lot of these comments is make sure that you're talking to people different than yourself if you're an ally, then actually take the time to listen and try and figure out what that means and try and institute something. One of the obvious problems would be tokenism, right? Where you do have diverse people on a panel or whatever, but you don't spend any time at all reforming the institution. So that's kind of what I'm hearing. So I think maybe we have time for 2 more questions. One of them, and I'll just highlight it before I ask the question that I want you to actually answer, is the one that I kind of figured would come up. Any recommendation of books or articles or resources for the stuff that we've been talking about today? So just keep that in the back of your mind. But before we do that, I think we have time enough for one more substantial question, which is, can the panel address how AI shapes the information that we get access to on social media. While it may be profitable to create information echo chambers, how does this affect society? So I think they're just asking for the effects of AI on social media and information and how that might affect us. Anyone have insight to lend here? Ulfa?
I can go ahead and start with that because I would say it definitely has an impact, right? And that is something that a lot of people have been, of course, studying, right, from in different disciplines. But I would recommend looking at some of the recent papers from my lab. I'm usually the last author in them, because they're co-authored with my students. And some of them do look at how polarization emerges as a result of this problem with information filtering, right? So try to look at that. But basically what happens as algorithms affect what you see and don't see, right? In the end of the day, it comes down to that, right? What happens is, in general, if you have polarization, which means if you start with, as in any society, right, with people divided into, camp blue and camp red, or, and so on, you will see actually a more divergence. Take an algorithm, right, the same algorithm, right, that's filtering information, and we tried this with diverse models, with the exception of probably just random recommendation, which is not an algorithm, obviously. You can't just, pick randomly. You will end up with increasing polarization. And we even have algorithms that try to mitigate that, try to, depolarize as much as possible to reduce the polarization. So it does affect social media. It does affect, I think polarization is probably the direct outcome that you can probably see, but also because we're talking about hiding information that's being hidden implicitly, of course. None of this is explicit, by the way. These are like just side effects, right? Is that people may not be able to see diverse perspectives about the same topic, and that definitely leads to shaping opinions, right? In the end, and further and further divergence. That's just one thing, right? Of course, it can impact also economic prosperity, as you can imagine, with, you may have certain products being visible just because you have popular items also have been seen to be over-popularized by algorithms at the expense of unpopular, items or niches. Think about independent artists and music and so on, and I believe there is also literature that showed that Spotify has kind of hidden gender bias in its music recommendations. That's just an example also, another example.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some research on this in like YouTube algorithms. And so YouTube is an interesting platform because there are boring people like me, academics. I'll put lectures or whatever on there for my students. But then there's like a lot of entertaining stuff, obviously. And one of the things that some researchers have looked at on polarization is just how you can sort of like one particular video, and then it recommends something else that other people who also like that video, and before you know it, you're in a very extreme part of the internet that you had no intention of visiting, but you got there because of the algorithm. So I'm just like giving an example. You just said everything, but I just said something else. I don't know if you wanted to add, Beth.
Well, I think there's kind of an inherent contradiction, right? So I was thinking about like Netflix, but it's the same kind of thing that you're saying on YouTube. So on Netflix, you can like a movie or like a TV show, and they want to give you more of what you like, right? That's the whole point of recommendations, is that, oh, you liked this movie, maybe you'll like this movie. And so you watch that movie. Yeah, I like that movie. And soon, like, all of your recommendations are of a certain type of movie. Whereas, I don't know, maybe there's a foreign language movie that is really good, or a documentary that would be really nice if more people watched it, but it's never getting recommended to me because all of my movies are action hero movies or something, right? So the whole point of recommendations is to give you more of the stuff you liked, but it becomes like a tunnel where it's excluding things that would give you a broader perspective, as you're saying, less silos and not so much polarization. So it's like an inherent conflict, right? How do you give people what you think they would like, which is the point, while still perhaps exposing them to some other things? I don't know how you fix that, but I think it's just built into the system.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And this is just a side thing that I'm thinking of. I have a bunch of friends who are in tech, programmers and stuff like that, and some of them make it a conscious effort to turn off their phones and turn off their computers after a certain period of time and like not go to sleep with them, because maybe I just have weird friends, which is possible because I spent a lot of time in Austin, Texas. But it's because they realized that the technology was getting so good at giving them what they wanted to see that they couldn't moderate the pleasure that they were getting from technology, so they had to learn how to turn it off. So it's kind of like sometimes technology can just like give us so much of what we want that if we don't take time to step back and scrutinize how we're living our lives, maybe we're giving it a little too much. And I think I've actually seen a lot of tech companies talking about, not having distracted driving, for example, is an easy one, but just moderating screen time or whatever. More and more softwares put that kind of monitoring things into their software. So really quickly, before we go to that last question about books or any recommendations you have, I just want to thank again the Digital Transformation Center and SGA for making this possible. Thank you so much. Hopefully you all have found this fruitful. It's been a lot of fun to talk with y'all. So this is the last question. We have about 6 minutes left, I think. Are there any media recommendations that you have for anyone in the audience wanting to learn about technology or AI, especially as pertaining to ethics or diversity or whatever angle you want to give? So panelists, any ideas?
BethCase.com. As I said earlier, in case you weren't here for that part, I've put up a whole list of readings on my website if you want to read more about disabilities and ethics in AI.
So as we move from transactional to strategic HR, certainly Ulrich is something that I think you should Google and read his work. Christensen has a book specifically for strategic HR. If you're interested in the selection process and how talent acquisition is done, SHRM would be a place that I would recommend that you go as well.
Could you repeat those names again?
Yes. The first one was David Ulrich.
David Ulrich.
Christensen, and I blanked on his first name.
That's
The
okay.
book is Strategic HR. And then SHRM is the Society for Human Resource Management. Okay. And plethora of information, not just on talent acquisition, certainly talent management, all the areas within HR. I would recommend a start there as well.
Great. Ulfa?
I would highly recommend a film. This is really more about bias against women in STEM disciplines. Film that Athena has screened actually for free and had a panel about it last year. It's called Picture a Scientist. That gives you an idea about the different facets and perspectives, about how gender bias emerges. It's almost never actually explicit. It's always done by good people, right? As we say, Right. There is also a book, I think called Blind Spot, and the undertitle is like Hidden Biases by Good People, I believe, by Banaji Grunwald. That's kind of like, the canon or, the Bible of learning about bias. And again, she's a neuroscientist, so, she uses a lot of, rigorous science to try to show that. And then I'll talk about like fair AI. So there is a book called When Is It Discrimination by Deborah Hellman that talks about, because when you start looking at fairness in AI, one of the biggest questions is when is it discrimination, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So another one called Fairness in Machine Learning, Limitations and Opportunities by Solon Barocas and colleagues. But also there are other AI tools. Fair AI tools IBM has one, it's called AI Fair 360 Degrees. Google has something called the What If tool. Microsoft has something called Fair Learn that's coming out of their responsible AI initiative that they started in-house. And then there is something called Bias and Fairness Audit Toolkit by Aikitas. And there are various also open source software tools on GitHub, both for users and researchers, and some of them are from our research group also. So many of them we have on our lab website. So open source code to model and detect and mitigate, also fix AI bias.
Great. So just to repeat, Imagine a Scientist, which is a film?
Picture Scientist.
Okay, a picture scientist.
Yeah.
The second one was Blind Spot?
Yeah, Blind Spot, Hidden Biases by Good People, of good people, yeah, by Naji Grunwald.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it seems like most of the major tech firms have some stuff on this.
So much that's open source even.
Okay.
You can actually take and use as well. As one thing about also like we talked about data science, how to change, the data science workforce. We have on our website, I have a research experience for teachers, right? Project that has several courses, curriculum, a sample curriculum that is about fairness in machine learning. Not all of them are available, but I believe one of them specifically about transparent recommender systems is available. That has been piloted in a high school in Louisville, Kentucky.
All right.
So,
Mia, we have about a minute, so I didn't mean to cut you off, but about a minute.
You're fine. So for me, this conversation is just a starting point, and I really want to emphasize on that. So the book I'm going to recommend is called The Infinite Game by Scott Sinek, which just focuses on any type of change you want to see. It has to be ongoing. It's not a short-term, easy fix. It's something that's going to require continued work. So that book is really about that mindset.
The Infinite Game.
The Infinite Game, yeah.
So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Digital Transformation Center and SGA. Thank you, panelists, for volunteering your time and coming to talk with us. I really appreciate it. And thank you, audience, for being here. Appreciate it.